Queer Discrimination, a Social Analysis by Leanne Mandel. Queer discrimination. To begin, we should define these two terms. According to dictionary.com, queer is, quote, a person whose sexual orientation or gender identity falls outside the heterosexual mainstream or the gender binary, end quote. And discrimination, also according to dictionary.com, is, quote, treatment or consideration of, or making a distinction in favor of or against, a person or thing based on the group, class, or category to which that person or thing belongs rather than on individual merit, end quote. So essentially, queer discrimination is discriminating against an entire group of the LGBTQ plus community without even thinking about the individual person. Like, once a person tells you their sexual orientation, you automatically assume that they are part of the larger scale and that they fall into all of the prejudices and everything. A note on the history of queer. In the past, queer referred to other or different, kind of just as a regular adjective that was used in common everyday language. In the recent past, however, it has been used as more of a derogatory term against the LGBTQ plus community to kind of exclude them from the social norms. And within the past decade, there has actually been a reclamation of the word queer, where the LGBTQ plus community is taking it back and using it as their own adjective to define themselves as a source of pride. And because this movement is still kind of new, there are a couple members, well, more than a couple, some members of the LGBTQ plus community who are still not comfortable with the use of the word. So it really depends on a person-to-person basis. It's also important to understand exactly what a social problem is. So according to our textbook, a social problem is, quote, a social condition, event, or pattern of behavior that negatively affects the well-being of a significant number of people, or a number of significant people, who believe that the condition, event, or pattern needs to be changed. This can be applied to the LGBTQ plus community because there are actually a large number of the population that falls into the LGBTQ plus community, especially in recent years as more people have found the different terms and are able to have an environment around them in which to explore their different sexualities and gender identities. And these people are largely discriminated against, and there are so many prejudices surrounding the LGBTQ plus community. And there's also a large amount of people that recognize that this is an actual problem in society and that these LGBTQ plus people are just people, just like everyone else. And so there's a want and a need to force this change that allows for the equal rights of those within the LGBTQ plus community. This social problem of queer discrimination is significant to me because I am personally a part of the LGBTQ plus community. And even though I have not been personally discriminated against, there are still laws and policies in place from our government that restrict LGBTQ plus members from doing certain things, which will be discussed later in the presentation. And LGBTQ rights is a modern discussion, and it affects a lot of people across the world and in the United States. Some of the underlying issues that accompany this social problem of queer discrimination is actually the ignorance that is like kind of passed down almost through generations. And that leads to a lot of the bigotry and discrimination and prejudices that are found against the LGBTQ plus community. And these people, these queers, are often seen as other and different from the social norm, which is derivative from its original meaning. And for those LGBTQ plus people within the community, when they have to come out to their parents, which is revealing their identity, whether it be their sexual identity or their gender identity, they have that fear of losing the loved ones who don't agree with their sexuality or their gender. And oftentimes people get disowned and kicked out of the house, and sometimes they can become homeless as well. And there's that loss of the sense of humanity that they have, and they lose family, sometimes they lose friends, and so they kind of lose that connectivity to society as a whole.
I've been thinking about why I haven't come out yet. Maybe it's because it doesn't seem fair that only gay people have to come out. Why is straight the default?
I have something I need to tell you.
Mom, there's something I have to tell you.
Can we talk?
Yeah,
I'm straight.
I'm straight. I'm sorry, Mom. It's true.
I like girls.
I like men.
You get that from your dad, is that?
I'm in love with Nick.
I feel like I've been raising a stranger.
Yes, absolutely, you have.
I'm heterosexual.
Oh, God, help me, Jesus, please.
As most people know, being heterosexual is actually the social norm. And it's very interesting to think about how no one has to come out as straight. When talking about queer discrimination, it is important to understand the beginning of the LGBTQ plus movement, which is accredited to the Stonewall riots. The Stonewall riots took place on June 28th of 1969 at Stonewall Inn. And this was a gay bar, but in the 60s, you could not advertise it as a gay bar. So it was undercover, and oftentimes the police would try to bust it. But because the gay bars were operated through the mafia, there was always tips of, hey, the police are going to come. So like everyone was able to clear out in time. Unfortunately, on June 28th, that was not the case. The police raided Stonewall Inn and they entered the club and they were roughing up patrons. They ended up arresting 13 people, including employees of the bar and some of the people who violated the state's gender-appropriate clothing statute. So female officers took suspected cross-dressers into the bathroom to actually check their sex, which is really like an invasion of privacy. And there were angry patrons and other people outside of the bar, and they were very upset when people were being manhandled by the police. And at one point, an officer hit one of the lesbians over the head trying to get her into the police car, and so shouted at the crowd to act, inciting the crowd to throw pennies and bottles and stones and just other objects at the police. Pictured on the left is Marsha P. Johnson, who was a prominent figure during the movement, and she was a gay transgender drag queen and was a very important figure in the fight for LGBTQ plus rights. A more modern example of queer discrimination happened at the Pulse nightclub on June 12th of 2016 from 2:02 to 5:15 a.m. A total of 49 people were killed and more than 50 were injured. According to the graph on the right, you can see up until 2016 that the Pulse shooting was the deadliest mass shooting in modern U.S. history. It happened to be Latin night at Pulse, which is Orlando's best-known gay bar. And the shooter came in at 2:02 and later on a phone call proclaimed himself an Islamic soldier and had actually planned the shooting and was looking up the Pulse nightclub on social media and everything like that. And it was a very traumatic experience. Some people were able to run away, but some were wounded and played dead on the ground to avoid being shot to death, and others were barricading themselves in the bathroom. At one point, the shooter was holding hostages and was surrounded by bodies and was laughing and shooting the already dead bodies on the ground. And some of the hostages, he actually just shot them point blank in front of other survivors, which is a terribly traumatic thing to go through. And there were vigils held and everything like that, and it was such a blow to the LGBTQ plus community. But as much as there is bad in the world, there is some good as well. There was a Supreme Court decision on June 26th of 2015 that legalized same-sex marriage. The ruling was 5-4 in favor, which is very close. And the Supreme Court said that the right to marry is fundamental and that couples of the same sex should not be deprived of that right and liberty. And states can no longer keep same-sex couples from marrying, and they have to recognize the union. I personally remember hearing this news, and I was so overjoyed at the idea of being able to marry whoever I wanted that I actually just started crying, which was actually a fairly universal feeling throughout the LGBTQ plus community. One of the plausible solutions to this social problem of queer discrimination would be to help educate the general public, especially the young people in schools. And by doing that, it would be important to incorporate more queer information into schools. For example, in history, when talking about Alexander Hamilton, teachers can bring up the fact that he actually wrote letters to John Lawrence, a fellow male. And in literature, Shakespeare is theorized to be bisexual, or at least in the LGBTQ plus community, because his sonnets that he wrote, the first half of them, which include the famous sonnet, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, those were actually written to a young man that Shakespeare was in love with. And the later half of the sonnets were actually written to a woman that is referred to as the Dark Lady. So it is very likely that he was at least on the spectrum of LGBTQ+. It's also important to have queer artists and composers and athletes as a way to show students that there are queer people that enjoy the same things as them, and that there's nothing that is inherently straight and nothing that is inherently gay, and that we can exist together as a society. And again, that helps to mitigate the bigotry that is bred from ignorance. And I think it's important to have more awareness to queers in general, because this can help everyone learn to be more accepting of people that are different than them than previous generations have been. Thank you for watching my presentation on queer discrimination. On the screen are the sources that I used throughout my presentation. I hope you were able to learn something new from this. Thank you and have a good night.